Good morning. We are reviewing the conclusion of Ayin Beis. We are on page 1366. We finished the paragraph on 1366. This review, just for the record, is not literally learning everything, all the text. We did that already on the first study of it all, and then we concluded the Hemshech. Because the Hemshech is not finished, the Rebbe Rashab never finished it, we went into looking at other sources and other material to help us understand the background, the source material, as well as where the Hemshech would most likely have continued based on those Maimorim. So now, once we did that several months, we're now going back to the Ayin Beis, informed by all of that, to piece together all the whole picture. So the main focus here in this review is to get the bigger picture of Hemshech Ayin Beis. So in that context, we are learning, after the long discussion about Mamata Lamaila, how the interface, the theme of Ayin Beis, the interface of existence and the divine, or divine existence from the bottom up, meaning through our initiative, which is primarily through tefillah, prayer, and comes on page 1350. He begins, and now let's understand how it is Amshach Mamayla, which is primarily through Torah, because Torah is given to us from above. It's God's wisdom and God's will, God's blueprint, and as such, Torah gives us additional resources in this, creating this interface. Now it's Mamayla Lamata. To understand that, he asked a few questions, the Rebbe Rashab did. Some of these questions are not answered in Hemshech Ayin Beis explicitly, but we will be able to understand the answer based on the background, based on the source material, based on the entire context. So to explain that, he went into a discussion, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, Ner Mitzvah v'Teira. What's the difference between a mitzvah, the Ner of a mitzvah, the candle of a mitzvah, and the candle of a neshama, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom? And what's the addition of Teira? How is Teira add, and how Teira is different than neshamas? Basically, to understand all the different elements necessary to transform this world. So, of course, the neshama is the one that affects it all. The neshama is ultimately the ambassador and agent of God that comes into this world, into our body and into this physical world to make a dira b'tachtein. But the neshama doesn't come unprepared. It comes filled with resources. First of all, its own very natural resource, which is being a flame of God. Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom. Achelik alekama mamash, a soul created in a divine image, as we shall learn about as we go along, and we have learned about it. And the neshama, in addition to the neshama's internal resources, also it has Torah and mitzvahs. So Torah and mitzvahs serve as tools, if you wish, or instruments, divine instruments that support the neshama's work in fulfilling its mission of creating the full interface between divine and existence. And this already carries us we understand then the connection to the Maimer Mikra Hashem Elokeinu, because understanding their mitzvah b'Teira tells us that a mitzvah has an element that adds power to the neshama to be able to transform this world and also to transform the animal soul. And Torah, further, even more so, Torah brings in the Atzmi, Torah. This is what he said on page 1350 to 1352, briefly. But to understand that, he said, nearly Levayah, let's begin by understanding Hariyah. What's explained elsewhere in a Maimer, another Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, which is called Einenu, on the verse that we say in Nishmas, on Shabbos and Yontif. Say, Veinenu me'ires. So the Alter Rebbe explains it in a very powerful way, and the Mitler Rebbe elaborates in two Maimorim, which I posted on the group, where he says, but according to Hariyah, we'll understand this idea of the neshama and this resource is called mitzvah and Torah. Now remember, the neshama also works with tefillah, like we learned in Torah from the Alter Rebbe and the Mitler Rebbe, that the tefillah is part of how the neshama, through contemplation of Shema, brings to V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, transforming b'chol levavcha b'shnei Yetzirecha, transforming also the animal soul. the wick, transforming the oil into fuel for the divine fire and light. But now he's entered into the realm of understanding Er Hariyah. So to understand Er Hariyah, he goes into the concept of a Er Mekabel, which in the Spheres is the level of Malchus. Matter of fact, I was just looking at the Maimer Ve'eneinu Me'iris from the Alter Rebbe, which is printed in Maimori Admura Zaken on Siddur, on that prayer, on page 460. So he actually starts off right away and says that this Ve'eneinu Me'iris is all about Aliyas HaMalchus. It's all about Aliyas HaMalchus. And then he goes on to explain that Malchus is, of course, Riyah, but Malchus also has two other forms and two other levels of Er Makabel, the moonlight and the luminous stone, as the Alter Rebbe explains and elaborated in the Mitla Rebbe's Maimer. And that's now the basis of everything we're learning now. So this is going to go for quite a while until we get back to the three levels of Malchus and the Aliyah of Malchus. So the Aliyah of Malchus, in other words, if you want to put it in more Kabbalistic terms, is essentially the interface between existence, or the divine that manifests in existence, and the divine that's beyond existence. Because Malchus is the interface between Atzilus and Biyah. So on one hand, Malchus is like a Er Makabel. It doesn't have anything on its own. But on the other hand, it gets filled, Les Lemagama Klum, but it gets filled with the energy above Malchus, and it's generated through the work and activated through the work of Lamata, Allah Osman Lamata, as we elaborate upon. So Malchus becomes the key word now, in the sense of Malchus being this essential concept that we're discussing, which is transforming or elevating and transforming the Makabel, ultimately to receive the higher levels of the divine, but ultimately to become a mashpia in his own right, ultimately to the highest levels, as the Maimer Ve'eneinu Me'iris explains. So to explain these, so then we learned about what is a Er Makabel. We learned about the difference between Mashpia and Makabel, many different levels that we discussed, which I'm not going to review right now. But at the same time, and the two interpretations, Leslo Megamo Klum, and then he goes back after explaining how Malchus functions. He goes back on page 1364. Omnam yesh b'zeh gimel madreges. There's three levels of Malchus, and that's the example of Er Levana, Even Tev, and Er Hariyah, Er Riyah Sa'ayin. The three different forms on Er Makabel itself, and each one has something. Each one has a quality the other doesn't have, but they basically correspond to the three worlds of Bri, Yetzira, Asiyah. So here we see how Seder Shtalshlus all becomes part of this process of interfacing. Basically, the interface between the Mashpia and the Makabel and Mashpia. So the way it's in Bria, that corresponds to the moonlight. The way it's in Yetzira corresponds to the luminous stone that glows, the glowing stone. And finally, Asiyah corresponds to Er Hariyah. And Noz Tchiloson, Seifan B'Tchiloson. The ultimate goal is Dafka and Asiyah, which is where the whole purpose of creation is realized and actualized. Now, to explain that, he said, Yesh lahagdi mish levayrein al pi Hagdama amavur, another Hagdama, which is the Hagdama of explaining Mikra, Mishna, and Talmud, which is what we're in the middle of learning. That in p.1366 Chaim it says, and this is another Maimer, yet another Maimer from the Alter Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek, based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and I gave the sources for that too. So that's in Eira Teira Shavuos, page 1562, and it's based on a Maimer which is printed in the Memory Admura Zaken, Hanochas Harap, it's called Hanochas Harap Pinchas Raises, page 173 and on. Maimer said Shabbos Pashi Yisrei Tovkuf Ayin. Okay, so the p.1366 Chaim says that Mikra, Mishna, Talmud is that Talmud is in Bria, Mishna is in Yetzira, and Mikra is in Asiyah. And which is, and there is the Malchus in each one of those, Malchus of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiyah respectively. Other places it says that Mikra, Mishna, and Talmud is Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. So how do we reconcile that? So that's what we learned in the paragraph on page 41365 and 1366. where we stopped at the end of the paragraph. He explained Mikra, basically, briefly, that the higher something is, especially if it touches something that's beyond revelation, the only way it can be expressed is only in an actionable and external way, because it's so profound that it cannot be expressed except through the narratives, the stories, and the actual actionable mitzvahs, without the details and without explanation, in Mikra. So since it's coming from a level of Chabad, as he puts it, the exact words he uses is that when you're talking about a level that is like this, I'm just using the language he said. Because it's rooted in Chabad, which is such a high level, and the Chacham itself, Ayin to Motzah, which goes all the way back to a state that's super conscious, beyond intelligence, beyond consciousness, beyond understanding. So its expression is only in the level of Asiyah, because it's higher than Gilui. Giluyim, that's the domain of the worlds, especially Atzilus, but also Bria Yetzira. There's an and a Keli. The Keli and are commensurate to each other, so they're able to have appreciation of the Giluyim of the understanding of Torah. But if you want to have the so-called the etzem of Torah, the Torah as it is in its root, in Chabad, which is what Mikra is, Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah, the only way that can be expressed, because it's beyond Gilui, is dafki in the lowest level of pure action, which is why the Torah is written in a very simple way. Stories, and as I said, actionable mitzvahs without details and without explanation. So essentially, it's rooted in Chabad, like he said, Zois Vadai. Mikra is rooted in Chabad, but its expression is in the Nehi of Chabad, which is essentially Asiyah within Chabad, and therefore an Elam Asiyah as the so that reconciles both elements of Mikra being rooted in Chabad, but expressed in Asiyah. Like he concludes, now later we're going to get back to this to understand, obviously, this, even though he doesn't explicitly ever say it in Hemshech Ayin Beis, it clearly, from the beginning introduction, this corresponds to the vision of the eye, which is Nasiyah. But first, let's go back now. He's going to talk about Mishna, and then Braisa, and then Talmud. The other two levels, which is basically the oral Torah, which, as we said, Mishna is rooted in Chagas, and where does it manifest the Yetzira? So he's going to explain that now. We're going to learn now, continuing on. But keep in mind, he's talking about it from the context of Torah, but if you want in the context of the bigger picture, remember, Torah is, God is giving us a gilim amayla, matan Torah, a gift from above, his wisdom, his intelligence. That's what Torah is. Not just his wisdom and intelligence, also his will. So Torah, no nafshik sovas, he has invested himself. And he's the Torah essentially is divine. And he gives it to us. So essentially, Torah is a revelation of the divine. So it makes total sense that in Torah itself, you're going to have several levels. Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud. We'll discuss this later more in detail, but briefly, there are different levels, because remember, we're talking about, again, the interface between the Makabel and Mashpia. So in the Makabel itself, there's different levels. So Asiyah, what we learned about Mikra on one hand is giving us a very high level, but its expression in Gilui is in a very simplistic way, in a very surface level. So we say Ben Chumash LeMikra, even a child can learn a Pasuk in Chumash. It's only Ben Eser LeMishnah. At 10, we start learning Mishnah. At 15, we start learning Talmud, Gemara. On the other hand, Mikra carries the highest level of the divine. But through Torah Shabbat Peh, we'll come to appreciate it. So again, going back to the process, where we cannot jump immediately to experiencing the highest levels of the divine. So we have to first experience it in our terms. So in a way, Mikra, the mere fact that it's stories and just the facts about mitzvahs is actually very conducive for a beginner. But no one should be deceived into thinking that Mikra is a beginner book. It's actually coming from a level that's even higher than Mishnah and Talmud, like we're learning here. So basically, Mikra gives us a deeper experience of the divine, but on our terms as we begin our journey. So many ways, if you think about Riyah, that's what Riyah is. On one hand, you can't see without external light. Mikra will not be understood without Torah Sheba'al Peh, without the oral Torah. On the other hand, it's the eye itself that sees. So when the eye becomes acclimated and becomes refined enough, the eye will see, whereas moonlight and luminous stone don't have that capacity. Again, we'll discuss this later. I just wanted to put it in the context where we're going here, because we're talking the bigger picture here. So with that said, we are going, the process, in other words, of learning Torah is actually mirrors the process of growth, step by step. We go from the bottom up, even though Torah is mamay lamata, but the way we learn Torah, we have to learn in a way that's on our terms, that ultimately we're going to get through Torah a picture of the divine on the highest levels, all the way like he called it atzmi in the beginning of this discussion. On top of page 1352, he said, in contrast to ner mitzvah, Torah is atzmi. From atzmus and stuff. So Torah is going to give us, and as we learned at length in the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, Mikra Shamalakenu, the power of Torah. But to get there, we have to go through many steps. That's why chinuch, education, as a matter of fact, mitzvahs is what we begin doing before we even really understand Torah well, because a child can be taught to do a mitzvah. Torah requires a mature mind to fully understand. So we'll talk about this a lot more as we go along. I feel that the Rebbe Rashab, had he finished the Hemshech Ayin Beis, would have come back to Torah and discussed at length how Torah fits all into. That's why I'm laying it out right now, but we will get back to it, because at the end of the day, the Hemshech does never gets back to Torah. But based on the Maimorim that we've learned, and based on what we're understanding here now, it'll become very clear that Torah, ultimately, the highest level of Torah is Torah Riyah. You remember you said, Hamashpili Lires, Amagbia L'Sheves, Hamashpili Lires, Riyah, higher than Shmiya, which is the Aveda more Mamata L'Mayla, which is the Neshama on its own. And as said, we'll get back to that all, but it's all part of this picture here. So right now we're up to, after discussing Mikra, we're going to go now to Mishna, the second level, Mishna, which corresponds or rooted in Chagas and manifests in Yetzira, the world of Yetzira. So that's somewhat of a short summary, short relatively speaking, and we'll now continue learning, bottom of page 1366. Pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. If anybody wants to ask anything, I'm happy to answer any questions before I continue the summary here at the bottom of 1366.
I have a quick question, if I may. I wasn't in attendance on Friday, but I listened to the class. The question I had is that notion that Mikra is only made manifest in Asiya. It just from the perspective, let's say Kabbalistically, from the Seder Hishtalshalos, is that because it comes from such a high source that the ore of that, its essential ore, if you will, is too powerful, it's too bright, if you will, to become manifest in a higher world, that it needs to be degraded, if you will. I mean, I don't mean degraded like debased, but I mean it needs to be like amped down, like a step, like a transformer steps down power, the power line from the big power line that goes into your house. It needs to be mishtashla, has to devolve, if you will. That's probably a better word than degrade. Devolve into a level of energy that can be manifested. We as humans at a very low level can see and can make sense of. Do you understand the question?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to do anything. If it's going to be expressed at this higher level, the only place it could be expressed is in Asiya. That's essentially what he's saying. It's correct to say that once it comes in Asiya, we can begin to relate to it. But the words he uses, just to go to the actual text of the Rebbe Rashab, without need, he says like this at the bottom of page 1365. Because it comes from such a high level, which is founded on the high mountains, so to speak, holy mountains of Chachmei Law and Chachmei Ma'ayin Timotza. Imkain ein yochel love bisgalus, because it's coming from such a high level, which is even higher than revelation, it cannot become revealed shum hasoga, any comprehension. Rak ba hagili dafke b'asiyah mamish. Only thing that can be expressed is asiyah mamish. That's the way he explains it here. So, and then he goes on to explain. It says that in different words a little later as well. Whereas so I gave, I can't, I mean, probably at least an hour of explanation with maybe 10 examples. I gave example of speech, that we can't reveal the deepest, most intimate thing only in a very outer form.
Yes.
Gave the example of the love of a child. So if it's not clear, my suggestion is to review it again, to listen to the class again. Now, at the end of the day, yes, once it comes down Nasiya, then even a child can begin the journey, as I just explained. But it's not because Mikra has to come into, it has to be what you called amped down. It doesn't have to be anything. The thing is, if it's going to come in a state of Gilui, it's going to come in a very minimal, like a tip of the iceberg, which is the stories and the actual mitzvahs and without the details and without the explanation. Whereas Mishna, because Mishna does not come from that highest level. In other words, Mikra is the one that is closest, most plugged in, if you wish, to the source. So if you think of Torah, even though Torah Sheba'al Peh was given together with Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah Sheba'al Peh was given together with Torah Shebiksav, but Torah Shebiksav is the source of it all. When Hashem said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So the written Torah is the actual, if you want to put it this way, it's the closest CAT scan of God's mind and God's will. Once it comes into explanation in Torah Sheba'al Peh, you already get, it's still Torah. And obviously Torah is Hashem, and it's divine, and it's holy, and all of that. But it's already coming down into Eris and Kalim, as he put it, in the higher worlds. So essentially, the etzem of Torah is captured most in Mikra. And etzem cannot come into a full gilui. It only comes into outer expression in simple manifestation. Yeah. Okay.
But
Thank you.
I have a follow-up to that, though. In the higher worlds, what is it? What is it? Is it existing?
It's Chabad of Atzilus. He said clearly, it's Chabad of Atzilus, Mikra, and it manifests in the world of Asiya.
But is it more powerful? In other words, like I understand what Isaac is saying, and I'm not getting it. If you were
all I can tell you is review it again. And
Okay.
again, this is how we do it. We learn it. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I was teaching it at that length. You know, I'm not. It takes time sometimes till you can internalize it. That's fine, no problem. I mean, I'm happy to answer a specific question, but I don't want to go over another hour of review of it.
Yeah. No, I understand. Thanks.
And like he said at the end, it's expressed in letters. The letters of Torah, it's letters. One vav. He explained at the end when we learned at the bottom of the page. One vav, Torah Sheba'al Peh can elaborate for who knows how much to understand a vav. Well, we see in Mikra only a vav. You don't even know all the depth in it. Like he said earlier, say this niflois ma'ed. There's awesome secrets there carried within it. But what we see, it's like when we talk about when you give an example or a riddle, the more cryptic it is, the more it carries a certain depth. The only way the teacher can pass it on to the student is through a cryptic riddle because of its depth. But once you get it, you start realizing. Okay. So now on the bottom of page 1366, 3 lines from the bottom, Ayin Mishna, in contrast, however, you could say, however, or contrast, Mishna, Shehima Chagas Datzilus. Remember, Mishna comes not from Chabad, but from Chagas. Yoch Elias Am Shochas Etzem Hamidas Chesed Gvura Bi Yetzira. because it's not coming from such a profound superconscious level. Even though he didn't use the word atzmi, I used it because he used Torah as atzmi. So I don't know, Mikra is still not mamish atzmi because it's still a makabel, but nevertheless, relatively speaking, it is. But being that now Chagas is already a level of more revelation, not like Chabad and Chochmah Ma'ayin to Motzah. Therefore, the Etzem Midos from Chagas, the very core of those emotions, the Ches L'Gvura be its Etzem. You could have the Hamshach Etzem Midos Ches L'Gvura be Yetzira. That can manifest the Yetzira in a more revealed way. When it comes to Chabad, the only way we can actually get it expressed is through the Nehi within Chabad. But when it comes to Chagas, you could have the actual Chagas Sheba Chagas, so to speak, not the Nehi necessarily, even though all three levels encompass all of them, as we learned earlier. And he's now going to explain what that means. Now, just to give a little introduction to make it a little easier, think of Midos and Moichin as the two levels of Midos being a relationship with another. You love someone, that's a Midah. It's a relationship. The Moichin is something that's really more to yourself. So behind the Midah of love, there can be a tremendous amount of Moichin, of an intellect, of a cognitive process. But you don't necessarily have to express it all to the person you love. When you show love to someone, whether it's through an embrace or through words or whatever form, it's by definition an expression. Now, of course, love itself has many profound levels, and there are things you can't even express. That's why sometimes it's expressed in action. But by definition, an emotion is much more expressionable than intelligence. Now, that doesn't mean you can't explain things. An intelligent person can speak and explain and understand and analyze. But moichin, especially when you go to the deeper levels that we've spoken about, the resonance of a higher reality, is by definition something that is less, takes on less form than Midas do. So not that he doesn't bring this here, but in other places, I've talked about this in the previous classes, you see the physical body. There's three parts to the body in general. There's the moyach, what we call leiv, and kovid, or basically reish guf regel. There's the head part, the head. There's the torso, the chest, the body, guf, and regel is everything below the guf, the thighs and the legs. Interestingly, Chassidus asks a question. Most of the primary faculties of a person are in the head, the brain, the eyes, the ears, the speech, mouth, the nose. So you would think with so many faculties, the physical part of the head should be the largest part of the body. When you work your way down, even though there are organs in the chest, but they're not as many and not as primary as they are in the head. And the legs, even though they also have functions, but they have the least amount of faculties. And you see the legs carry almost half the body. Then the other half is mostly the chest, the torso, the body, and the smallest part is the head. So Chassidus answers, because wherever there's more oil, there's less keli. The more intense something is, the less container there is to express it. Like I gave the example of the speech and thought. That the deeper something is, the less words you're going to have to express it. To the point that the deepest experiences sometimes are not even expressible. Can't really express it in any words, or definitely not in any explanation. So in that context, basically, when something is rooted in a higher place, its expression is going to be in a much more minimal level. That doesn't mean it's not high. It just means expression-wise, doesn't have that many giluyim. So Mikra is Nasiyah. You only have the Nehi in expression of the Chabad. But Mishna, because it's rooted in Chagas and Midos, are more expressed than Moichin are. Again, doesn't mean Moichin can be expressed, but it's not quite like a Midos are. So therefore, Yochalius Amshach Etzem Midas be Yetzira Loidak Bechinas Nehi. You can actually get the Etzem Midas, the very emotions themselves. Shari Yedua, because it's known Shamidas Datzil same Bechinas Shayches El Elemis. When we say the Midas of Atzilus in contrast to Chabad of Atzilus, so remember he said Alpayim Shana Kodma Teir La'elam. Chachma Bina Alpayim Shana, it precedes the world. Because that's like, think of the architect as he's planning the design of his structure. He's not building it yet. Midas, on the other hand, are already engaging with the relationship. It's about like Elim Chesed Yibana, there's a chesed going on. There's an expression of love that's already an engagement. So Midas Atzilus already Shayches El Elim is relative to Chabad. El Elim is Biyah. U'kamei shekasa Zocher Rachmecha. Remember the compassion and the chesed. So me'elam here means, the literal meaning, it means because they are forever. But me'elam also means because they relate to elam. Uksiv ke'amati elam chesed yibana. Because I've stated, elam chesed yibana. The world is created with chesed. So you see from this that the midas chesed, that is, the first of all, the midas, is already a relationship. Like I said, love is already a relationship with another. In Elikus, it's the divine energy that relates to existence. Not quite like Malchus. That's why you still need Malchus, because the midas are still quite intense, but they're conceptually, they are in a state of, the whole definition of a midah is a relationship. That's what a midah is. It's an inclination, a relationship with something else. Whereas Moichin is more solitary, so to speak, more to itself. So basically, what you see from this, that anything rooted in Chagas does not have quite the intimate intensity like Chabad. So our Chagas and Chabad, human, is an example for what it is above. So essentially, Chabad of Atzilus captures more the divine within Atzilus. Chagas of Atzilus is already the divine as it relates to another in a relationship of Chesed and Gvura and Teferes and Netzach and Hayit Yisayid. So that is the contrast between Mishna and Mikra. He's going to explain it further in detail, but just the opening statement. Are there any questions about what we just learned?
But if you want a relationship with the divine, then don't you want it on the Chagas? I mean, isn't that what that's saying?
Yeah, but on the other hand, you don't have the divine completely on its own terms.
I see.
So yes, Mishna is definitely going to be more relatable to us, and that's why we can understand it. Whereas Mikra doesn't have much understanding or explanation. On the other hand, Mikra has a closer experience of something that is purely divine beyond us. So it all comes down to like we've discussed, the whole Hemshech Ayin Beis. As soon as you talk about interface, you have to deal with things that are on our terms and things on God's terms, and we want to have both. So that's why all are necessary. All these levels are necessary. And Mishnah will help us grow to have a relationship on the level of Chabad and Mikra. In other words, not just that you love God, but you also want to correlate to God and understand Him as He is on His own terms. Yeah. Yeah. So now the next page, 1367. You just said that the Midas are connected to the worlds. But we learned earlier that the source of the worlds is actually Malchus. Because Malchus, everything gets concealed is channeled and concealed in Malchus. Malchus then can filter and regulate the flow into Biyah. So everything here is relative. In other words, Malchus is already how the Midas manifest and actually relate to the other. But Midas has already a relationship with another. Like we learned earlier, if you remember, he said that the difference between Midas and Malchus, that Midah, you can have an emotion even if you don't have someone to be mashpia to. You could feel kindness and love in your heart, and then you could be distressed over the fact that you don't have anyone to give love to. In Moichin, that's not the case. Moichin does not need any other For you to sit and intellectualize or understand something, you don't need anyone else. Midos, you can have an emotion, and therefore you need someone else, even if you don't have them. Malchus, he said, even the Yetzira of Malchus is not there without another. But Midos is already a step closer, like he says, Chagas al kaponim el ilmus, ukiyadua, as it's known, the b'china zo, who shenis samsim ha'er liyas be'erech ha'ilmus. That the level of zo, which is Midos, the er was diminished in order for it to be more commensurate to the worlds. That's why it's called a small face. Zoyer in Aramaic is small, Ampin is a face. So Arich Ampin in Keser is called a long face, implying that it's far more, it's unfettered, it's unlimited in that sense. But Zoyer Ampin is already, as the Midos are relating Zoyer in a more limited way. Now, let me just add something that may be very helpful here. What we can derive from all of this is an interesting thing. You know, when we talk about human interactions, human relationships, and we talk about our cognitive skills and our emotional skills and our behavioral ones. So, yes, there's a lot of profound psychological insight into how the mind works and how the emotions work and how they interact with each other and so on, and how that translates into behavior, to human behavior. But what's fascinating here is this. Remember, God is not defined by human intellect, by intellect and emotions. These are all creations of the divine. God did not need a mind and did not need emotions. He created them in order to have something for us to relate to. So when we say the human being was created in the divine image, what does that mean? It means that the divine, which is beyond any image and beyond structure and beyond definition, including Chabad, Chagas, Nehi, chose to manifest divine energy into something, what we call Adam Elyon, the structure of an Adam, as we've learned a number of times. So the Adam HaTachton, the human being, was created like a mirror image that parallels the divine human, so to speak. Not human, but the divine human structure. So when you think about Chabad, Chagas, Nehi, and Atzilus, what is really being said is, that's not just, just like we have a mind and emotions and then behavior, so too Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. It's much deeper than that. The divine, which is beyond any definition. Let's say Lifnei Tzimtzum. Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's one seamless divine consciousness. No structure at all. Not getting down to the 10 hidden spheres, God envisioning and existence. Once he created a tzimtzum and once he created structure, so essentially he didn't just say, okay, I'm emanating 3 levels, Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. No, he did it also in a way that Chabad captures more of the divine nature. Like we said, intelligence allows you to transcend your subjective interests. Because emotions, at the end of the day, I'm talking about human emotions, are subjective. That's what an emotion is. What's in it for me? Am I attracted to this? Am I repelled by this? That's what emotions are. So if we were only a bundle of emotions, we'd be more like animals, which are driven primarily by their instincts. Yes, they have an intelligence, seichla nikna, to how to hunt, how to find a partner, how to breed, how to compete, how to protect themselves. But that intelligence is all about survival. That's why you cannot expect an animal to suppress its emotional instincts. An animal is hungry, or an animal is in heat, or an animal has any other emotional, it's very structured. That's how it's wired. You can't, that's exactly the way it was meant to be. A human being can be expected to moyach shalat al alev. What does that mean? Because ruach ha-behema yeredes lamata, the animal spirit is driven by survival, looks down. Like we learned that length in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. It's about its own existence. A human being was given a neshama, ruach ha-adam, eila l'mayla. We have a transcendent side to us. And that transcendent side is primarily seen, experienced in our minds. Because the mind can travel beyond our subjective interest. The mind can say, yes, I understand you're hungry. I understand you're tempted. I understand you're being seduced by your emotions for something that is attracting you, that you may find pleasure in, but we have a higher purpose. And the mind can travel to places that are beyond our natural, instinctive, subjective emotions, beyond our impulses. So emotions are essentially impulsive, and the mind is essentially reflective, a healthy mind. We're not talking about a mind that is meshuchet and biased and prejudiced by emotions. That's when a judge has to recuse themselves if they have any type of any interest involved. But we're talking about a mind, a healthy mind, is meant to be precisely that, to take us to a place that your natural impulses will never take you. So the mind is really opening you up to a reality greater than yourself. When we say v'yadaita ayin v'shavesa levavecha, the v'yadaita is critical, that we are able with our minds to go to a place, and that's where chokhmah, especially chokhmah, but in general Chabad, but specifically chokhmah goes ma'ayin to motzah, takes us to ayin, to a place that's super conscious, to experience a reality greater than ourselves. Like I've explained many times, Siddur says intellect is not just understanding things. Intellect is experiencing reality, a truth, and a reality greater than yourself. That's its real purpose. It's like a channel to Ein Sof. That's what Chokhmah really is, and Chabad in general. Midos is already taking that alakus and coming this tzamtzum to relate to another. And there you do need to have a subjective feeling, because it's about what do I feel? And the point is, you don't want to just live in the world of Chabad. Chabad takes you to a higher place, but then you have to bring it down into your experience, your subject. In other words, your objective experience of something greater than yourself should now become part of your subjective experience that is all about yourself. All about yourself, I don't know all, but also relates to who you are. In other words, your self-interest is being informed by your objective transcendent element. So that's essentially, therefore, Chabad and Chagas, if you think of the hierarchy, are not just a mind and emotions. It's actually a higher reality and a one that comes down into a more tzimtzumdik way that already relates to existence and relates to ourselves, relates to others. That's somewhat of a little deeper explanation of what he's saying really in about Chabad and Chagas. So when you learn Mikra, you actually can feel it. Mikra, we're going to learn a little later, he's going to say a number of pages later, I think, from the Pardes on page 1372, that when you learn Mikra, you can see there's something that's beyond us, because it's not comprehensible. Someone starts learning Chumash, yeah, with Rashi you can understand Pshat, but you don't really get the full story. Mishna is much more on our terms. Mishna is still quite abstract and difficult, but it's already talking in terms where we can get into the details and then the comprehension, especially with Talmud, which we'll learn about later. So bottom line is, this samtzim be'erech ha'elmis mal shem zen nikra zoyer ampul. But who can moshel? And now this is the moshel that the Medrash brings, that had the pisrois hamavur b'Medrash u'kamoshon is bar le'il. So right at the beginning of Breishis Rabbah, Medrash Rabbah, Breishis Rabbah, he gives the example of Yetzira Emen, that the Torah is like the blueprint. Pisrois are like the etchings. You see an architect create a blueprint, so they create little sketches. So Pisrois or Pinkasois is the term used in Medrash. He uses the word Pisrois. It's basically the etchings and the markings. Markings maybe is even a better word. The markings and the points that the architect makes before he actually builds a structure. So that's a mashal the Medrash gives on Torah. So in that sense, it's in a tzimtzumdik way. Because it's not, you don't see the whole elaborate. It's a diminished. It's like a microcosm in miniature, the structure. So he's calling that pisrois. That's the samtzim lias be'erech ha'elamis. So in other words, before the pisrois, what was the architect like? He had a vision. Same thing, God had a vision for existence. But then he wanted that vision to be somewhat documented. So the first place he documented is in a blueprint. And he's associating that to the Midos. That's already in a diminished form. he's taking his big vision and putting it into a blueprint, which in turn will be, based on that, the building will be built based on that. So because the Midos Chagas is already a state that's coming into revelation, it's not like Chabad that remains somewhat elusive and abstract and beyond. Like I mentioned, like we've mentioned, I'm Ayin to Motzah, touching on a reality of the divine that is higher than our comprehension. Because Chagas is already a revealed state. So we talked earlier, a revealed state. It manifests in a world. Which world? That's why it can be revealed in the world of Yetzira. Whereas Mikra is Dafka Nasiya, which is the most diminished form. Here, it could be revealed because it's already come down in a revealed form and in a diminished revealed form. Not to confuse, the diminishment of Midos is not like the diminishment of Mikra. Mikra, we're going to learn about this a little later. He's going to contrast them. Mikra is because it's so fun, such a profound, intense level. The only place it can express itself is in the outer level. Here, we're talking already an active, deliberate process of taking from Chabad and turning it into Chagas, into Midos, that relates to existence. And that, since it's a diminished light can be revealed. We're in the world of Yetzira.
Just not to interrupt, but this is what I was asking about. He uses the word nitzamsem.
But you asked before about Mikra.
I know I did, but it's a kal v'chomer. How much more so is it nitzamsem in order to have?
So why didn't he use the word nitzamsem by Mikra?
Well, that's a good question, but it doesn't mean it's not true.
That's why I gave you my answer before. That's exactly the reason I.
But you just said yourself. You just said it's such a high level.
I said it's not there is because of its intensity. The only place it can be expressed is only in an external way. Here is the opposite. Because it's a diminished flow of that's why it can be expressed in Yetzira. Mikra is not a diminished flow. Mikra is
I see. Okay, thank you. Now I understand. Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so now once he's established...
Apologies for interrupting.
So once he's established that Chagas now can be revealed in Yetzira, now he's going to go back to Mishna. What's the connection to Mishna? U'lechein mavur b'Mishna. And that's why in the Mishnah it's explained, Kol haprotim b'Ischalkus. Like we said earlier, you talk about, let's say, the mitzvah of tefillin, hanochas tefillin, or asiyah sukkah, building a sukkah. In Chumash, it's one pasuk. V'hayil teitov is bein einecha. Or b'sukkahs teishru shivas yamim. In Mishnah, it's going to be filled with details. Kol haprotim b'Ischalkus asher be'efen kazeh kosher hakorban. Here he goes, and he doesn't use tefillin and sukkah, he uses now korban. In this manner, the Mishnah will tell us the korban, the offering in the temple is kosher. In other words, when it says in the Mishnah, what are the details? What makes a korban kosher or not kosher? So let's say, the Mishnah will say, if it has a mum, has some injury, terminal injury, or other things that passel it, or the Mishnah will say, no, it's intact. Then it's kosher, which means, in language of Chassidus, that this korban could elevate and be encompassed in Ein Sof. If it's possible, you can't use it as a korban. Korban from the word kiruv, where you're elevating the physical world, the animal world, to the divine. So there are conditions. And the Mishnah will tell you the details of those conditions. The kachi midas chazdei. And the Mishnah is telling us that that's midas chazdei. This is the mid of chesed of the Eibishter. Shegam b'chinas nivra yachal lekara v'lichl b'elikus. When the Eibishter gave us the mitzvah of Adam ki yakiv mekem korban l'Hashem, he did a chesed with us. He said, I'm giving you a way to connect with me, to get closer to me. That even a nivra, yachal lekara v'lichl b'elikus, can get close and be encompassed with the divine. Remember the interface. So basically that's a mid of chesed. The Mishnah tells us the details of how that needs to be done. Ain't a kosher hakorban. And the Mishnah tells us, and in another manner, if you don't do it the right way, it's not kosher. The korban is not kosher. B'nisrachik, the ain't meir by Midos chasdei is barach. And in a psul, that disqualifies that animal from being a korban. So then it's nisachik, the opposite of kiruv. Kiruv means it brings us closer, like it's a relationship, chesed. If it's not kosher nisachik, you have to distance yourself, and in it does not radiate Midos chasdei yisbarach. So basically, the fact that the details in the Mishnah are telling us what way that we manifest God's chesed in our lives. These are the details that make the korban kosher, that we miskarev, and we can experience that chesed. And here are the details where chesed will not radiate and then renders the korban not kosher, and there chesed does not manifest. That's an example. Ukahai gavna, and similar, b'chol ha-mitzvus or mitzvus leisaseh. You just used one example here. Same thing with all the positive mitzvahs and all the negative mitzvahs. Nizbor b'mishna prote inyanim. So I'll explain in the Mishnah the details of these halachas of all the mitzvahs and mitzvahs leisaseh. We understand that it's not explained as much as in Talmud, and we'll learn about that later. But compared to Mikra, that's the whole point of the Tanoim. When they began to write down the Mishnah, or before when they learned it Baal Peh, that's what they were doing. They were analyzing different mitzvahs in the written Torah and saying, here are the details of what exactly makes a korban kosher, not kosher, the same thing with all the mitzvahs and mitzvahs leisas. The zehu, and the reason for this, the deeper reason for this is lefisha mishnei b'chinas chagas. Why does the Mishnah do this? Mikra, you don't find this. Mikra, you're not going to find these details. Even though in Psukim there are expressions of what makes something kosher, not kosher, but even that itself needs explanation. Much of it is very, very brief and sometimes cryptic even. Because Mishnah is from Chagas, not from Chabad. Shubchin is Gilead. Chagas is by definition a Gilead. Chabad is more of to yourself. It's more Gilead than Keser. So we're not going to say there's no Gilead in Chabad at all. But compared to Chagas, Chagas is where the divine engages. We say God's chesed. He wants to do chesed with us. In Chabad, it's God's plan. Like think of it, I don't want to use the word blueprint now because he used it by the Pisrois, but it's more God's plan, the mind and the will and the kavanah within it all. But Chagas is a Gilead. The Mikra nemer hakol b'ktsara. In the written verse, everything is said in brief. Because there, the hamshacha, the transmission, and the gilui, being that it's coming from such an atzmizdika level, is only nehi. You're only getting the outer expression of the kitzur. Therefore, it's b'kitzur. Al kein bo rag b'chinas klolos. That's why it's expressed only in general terms, in Mikra, in the written Torah. The nehi hu b'chinas katnus, hainu shekol dover hu b'chinas klolos levad. Nehi is a level of katnus. You could say a diminished level. Katnus means it's very, very diminished. That everything is in general terms. So it's like you would tell a child, do this, don't do that. You're not going to give the child the whole elaboration, what are the reasons behind it, and all the details. Just giving commands, so to speak. Calls that nehi, which is katnus and klolos levad. Or Mishna, on the other hand, Mishna, liyesa b'chinas chagas, being that it's a level of chagas, which is a more revealed level, al kein bo b'chinas pratis. That's why it comes into a state of details. Okay. Just for the record, a lot of the text we're reading here, I see it's marked by me, is really the language of the Tzemach Tzedek's Maimer that I mentioned before. If you want to look it up, it's Eira Teira Shvuos. Again, bottom of page 1662. So I think it's in volume 5 in Bamidbar Neira Teira. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of this is that language with some additions.
What was the page number again?
I said 1600. No, not 16. Sorry, 1562. The bottom of 1562 and on.
Thank you.
Aleph Tov Kuf Samach Beis. Yeah. So now there's a qualification. Ba'agam sheba Mikra. And though in the Mikra, in the verses in the written Torah, Nemru kol mitzvah sesu mitzvah leisaseh, it does tell us all the positive and negative mitzvahs. So it's not really a question, it's a qualification. In other words, you do have details. It's just not the details of every mitzvah, but you do have 613 mitzvahs, 248 positive and 365 negative. Shem b'chinas chesed gvura. That's the key. Not just the number, not just the details. They are chesed and gvura. Mitzvah sesa by definition is chesed, like we said, the positive, God's chesed. Gvura, mitzvah leisa, what to avoid is like a gvura, to refrain from. Oh yeah, but no, he's both points. Sorry, I'm saying sorry about my sorry. He said both points. First thing that we see in the written Torah, there's also chesed and gvura. You said before it's only Chabad, and chesed and gvura comes in Mishna. But number one, we find mitzvah ses mitzvah in the written Torah. Ve'en gam kein bepratim rabim, and there's also many details. Ramach mitzvah ses, 248 positive mitzvahs, b'shasar leisaseh, and 365 leisaseh. He's not saying it's Mishnah, but to say that it's completely an akuda, you see clearly. Number one, there's kavim, chesed and gvura, right and wrong, yes and no, so to speak, and they also have details, all these detailed mitzvahs. So he answers, Zeo mipnei, that's due to the fact, shegam nihi nechlak l'kavim, that even when Chabad comes into Nehi of Chabad, which is Mikra, it's also divided into kavim. Even when you bring something down to a behavioral level, just an action, like we said before, asiyah, Nehi, because it can't come in any more revealed level, that doesn't mean there's no structure. You know, when you tell a child, for example, don't cross the street or eat this healthy food, even if you don't go into any details, that's not like no kavim at all. That's not complete and amorphous state. Compared to Mishnah, obviously Mishnah becomes, it blossoms and expands into a whole expression and so on, like we're learning. But there's kavim there. Like he says in Eitz Chaim, that also Nehi divides into kavim. Well, first of all, there's netzach, heard you say, right there, there's kavim. So it's just like chesed gvura teferes is right, left, center, Nehi also has a right, left, and center. Aval b'chol mitzvah b'frat, but when you get into every specific mitzvah, eina mavur b'mikra haprotim shabah. The mikra is not going to tell you what are the details of each mitzvah. So in other words, you have general kavim in Torah shebiksav. Like he said before, b'chlolos. You definitely have a kav, a positive one, a negative one, positive mitzvah, negative mitzvahs, 248 positive, 365. You have a structure, but it's in very general term, but you don't have the details within the structure itself. You're not going to have details. Al Mishnah, but Mishnah mavur hakol b'protius. In Mishnah, everything is explained in detail. Because it's rooted in Chagas. The kol midah klula miyud, miyud. And there, every midah is encompassed of 10, and the 10 of another 10. So basically, every midah has 100 within it, because it has all the 10 spheres and then another 10. Now, we learned before, he also has Niskalulus. But clearly the Niskalulus there is in a far more diminished way and far more general terms, like he said. But in Midos, so basically if you talk about the difference in behavioral emotions and emotional emotions like chesed is the whole full experience of love. Nehi, it's more of the action involved in what love is about. Not so much the full feeling behind it, but how it translates into an actionable form. V'zehu Mishna b'Yetzira, and that's what he means Pri Etz Chaim, but he said that Mishna is a Yetzira. The Mishna liyosef b'chinas Chagas, Mishna being that it's a level of Chagas in Atzilus, Yochel liyos is galus be'elam haYetzira. It's capable and to be revealed in the world of Yetzira. The dafke be Yetzira v'loy ba'asiyah, and dafke Yetzira not nasiyah, because you could say, okay, fine, Mikra is dafke nasiyah, but why can't Mishna be both Yetzira and asiyah? V'loy ba'asiyah mepnei ki b'chinas Chagas hamshocha hi ma'atzmius Chagas leirak b'chinas nehi shabai. Because when it comes to Chagas, you're not getting the outer expression of Chagas, you're getting the atzmius of Chagas. Just like Mikra is the atzmius of Chabad, and therefore its only expression is in the Nehi, here you're already getting a Gili, and you're getting the etzem of the Gili, not just Nehi. So therefore it's Dafki Yetzira where there's a Gili. Nehi is already a limited flow, a concealed flow. So that's why Mishna is Dafki Yetzira, not Nasiyah. Yes, we learn Mishna in the world of Asiyah, obviously, but its nature, its personality is a Yetziridic personality, because it has shape and form, like he's explaining here, because it's coming from a level of Gili. So the paradox here is exactly that which is not as etzem in Atzilus comes in a more revealed way and it becomes very developed, and that's the world of Yetzira of Mishna, not just Nehi. V'hainu b'amshocha de Teira. The Rebbe Rashab is qualifying this point, I think, that I just made. Not that Mishnah doesn't come in Asiyah. In the context of Amshocha of Teira, you're talking about how Teira transmits. Mishnah is a Yetzira level, and Mikra is an Asiyah level. That's why it's not capable of being nimshach in Asiyah. We mean, when we say in Asiyah, we mean in its as a Mishnah is supposed to be. That's why you don't teach Mishnah to Ben Chamesh Mikra. Chamesh Mikra is not ready for Mishnah yet. Obviously, he can read the letters, but we're talking about if Mishnah is going to do what Mishnah does, you need to be the level of Yetzirah, not Asiyah, because it's not a Nehi expression, it's a Chagas experience. So, for example, little children can have emotions, but their emotions are more Nehi. Maybe Nehi sheba Chagas, but Nehi. Whereas Chagas is usually reserved, in the fullest sense of the word, to a more mature person's emotions. I think I'm going to stop here for many reasons, but especially because the next section is like, it needs a lot of explanation. I rather reserve a class to it rather than just read it quickly in a cursory fashion. And we can go into more detail because he's going to explain the difference between now Mikra, Mishnah, in the context of Chabad and Chagas. And actually, I see here, I mentioned that it's the etzem of Chabad. He's actually going to say, Amshocha is not from Atzmis Chabad, only Nehi. So we'll learn that in the next class. But I think I'm going to stop here. I think it makes sense. There's a lot to digest regardless. Anybody wants to ask anything?
Well, I'm coming to full circle here. Sorry, but you just said that the Nehi is a diminished expression necessarily because it's the lower realm of the spheres, and Mikra manifests in Asiya as Nehi, as a action, basically, not a whole lot more.
The story is
so,
that right. The story is
so
that
it's necessarily diminished. When you say diminished, you use the word diminished for
are we
he.
going to go back
That's
to semantic? Is this a semantic discussion or a
well, no,
content?
I'm not trying to play games about semantics, but it feels like in order for us to be able to understand Mikra at all, it's like you say chitzonius, I say diminished or mitzvah.
I'm only repeating what the language he uses here. He doesn't use the word symptom in by Mikra, and he uses it only by Mishnah. So I'm only really translating what it says here. If you have a question, you have a question. But I stand by what I said before. What's the problem here exactly?
Well, I mean, just that. Is it not correct that Mikra manifests in?
With all respect, just because you said it doesn't mean here he doesn't use the word symptom by Mikra. He just doesn't use it. And I explained why. Correct? He doesn't use the word symptom. He could have used it. He used it by Mishnah.
I'm not coming to challenge you or argue with you. I'm trying to understand how the chitzonius of this elokus of Mikra is not a diminished form of light.
You can call it whatever you like, but the bottom line is the way I would translate what he said, to use the words, that's the way he puts it. The only way you're only getting the tip of the iceberg is what I would call it. More of that. You're getting just the outer expression of it. You want to call the outer expression diminished? That helps you? Great. I don't see it here in the language. The language diminished he uses primarily by Mishnah, or not only primarily. The word symptom he uses by the Mishnah. Now, the fact is that a person who's learning Mikra, yes, is only learning an outer dimension, so that and technically you can call it, that's why I asked you if it's semantics. If you must use the word diminished, I wouldn't use that word because I want to make the contrast. To me, as I said before, it's, and I don't know what more to add.
I just need to think about it some more. I guess what you're saying is that even though it's the chitzonius, it's the externality of the essence of Chabad, the essence of Torah, it's still unadulterated. Whereas you think about, Nitztamsem, it is adulterated. It's not exactly all that it is. It's just you're getting.
But let's. I think it's always good to have what's called my benayu. What difference does it make? How does this change anything? Like what's the punch?
Well, yeah.
What difference does it make? We know that Asiya is a lower world than Yetzira and Bria. It's the lowest of worlds. And in that sense, Asiya, generally speaking, is less alakuz begoli than there is in Yetzira and Bria. That's correct. But we're talking here the ishtalshlus of Torah. He's talking about how Torah, where it says in Pri time, that Torah manifests in the world of Asiya. And he's explaining because it's actionable. The Torah is like what you teach a child. A child, you can't teach them the details yet, the understanding of it, the deeper meanings. So you tell them a story. You tell them, here's the mitzvah. Here's what you do. That's the key thing he wants to explain. Because Mikra is rooted in a place that's Chabad and even higher than Chabad, Ayin to Matzah, like he said. And therefore, to use again the words, keeps using those words, that its only expression is Nasiya Mamish. I'm explaining exactly what it says in the Maimon.
I hear you.
Mishnah is a whole different story. Mishnah is not rooted in Chabad. Mishnah is rooted in Chagas. And Chagas, from the outset, is already a Gilui, and a Gilui that relates to existence. So that can be revealed in its full glory. And it is in the world of Yetzira.
Here's why it matters. Here's why it matters.
Anyway,
it's not about me.
I think we should take it offline because there's other people in the class. I don't know if everybody's necessarily bothered by this. So I'm happy to explain it, but I think we should, I don't think, because we discussed it. I don't want to go, when people listen to this class, I get comments. I want to keep it focused to the mimer, and anything that needs more explanation, I'm happy to provide. So let's stop here. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop here the recording, And if you want to continue, tell me what difference